And so I do think it's really important to point to those models and just be like, look, you can support people this much. And again, the wheels don't fall off society. This is, these Nordic countries are actually wealthy. Yes, they do have problems. I think it's really important to talk about the fact that there's a kind of welfare chauvinism or xenophobia rising. But I think also to contextualize that economically and say it's actually because people fear and to some degree, it is actually because people fear losing what they have. There's still, again, insecurity is forward looking. So even if you're sitting in Finland with your baby box, and your job, if you have any political awareness, this can be taken away from you, and that there are forces eager to privatize the welfare state, or maybe you have the vague sense there's just not enough to go around because you've been listening to right-wing commentators or whatever, and that these anxieties, are fueling the right-wing turn. In terms of my own, political imagination and how it was formed, there is a chapter where I talk about my two grandmothers in the book in different chapters, because one is the quintessential Canadian hippie, if there's such a thing, who in the 1960s goes and moves to the Yukon Territory, which, for listeners who don't know, it's like basically near Alaska. It goes it's next to the Arctic. And my other American libertarian grandma, who lived south by the Mexican border. And in the book, I actually toned my grandma down because I just thought the truth of her is too much. And so I tried to use her in a way that both made some political points, but also would get some laughs. But the truth is, when I was giving the lecture, I gave that specific lecture that mentions my libertarian grandmother in Vancouver. And, I thought the stories I told were really funny, but the Canadians in the audience just looked so mortified. You're just like, what the fuck? That lady's your grandma? Because I tell the story about how I was like a 7 or 8 year old vegetarian. I'm still vegetarian. And I'd go to grandma's house and she would purposefully put bacon grease in her cookies just to torture me. That was just the tip of the iceberg with her. So she was a diehard Randian. I will say that she was introduced to Ayn Rand in Canada. So Canada is not guilt free on this point. But she, so for example, one thing I don't say in the book is that my younger sister, Sonora Taylor, who's a really interesting writer and thinker in her own right, who does a lot of work around disability justice and the environment, is a wheelchair user. And, when we were kids, my grandmother would say, well, there's no such things as rights. Sonora doesn't have rights. She's just dependent on the charity of the family. She's just lucky that our society is charitable and doesn't leave her to die in the woods. This is grandma's libertarian political vision, right? So it was incredibly formative. And she could just tell, from the time I was 6 years old, that something was off with me and I had socialistic tendencies. And so we were always butting heads. But her political extremism and fundamentally her lack of care, what I felt was a lack of care, and naivete about capitalism really did shape my perspective, from a young age. She was someone who, absolutely could not envision a positive role for the state. And that was just something, so that was just something that, I was wrestling with a lot, even as a really young person, before I sort of fully understood her worldview or the implications of it. It just seemed very clear to me that we needed some kind of entity that would regulate things like pollution, that would guarantee the provision of things like education or safe transport or, healthcare for people. But she just had, a very, very different worldview. But my hope, is also that part makes people laugh a little bit, at least, because otherwise it's, there's a lot of otherwise very serious commentary in the book. And if you can't make fun of your family, what else can you do?
It strikes me. You said southern border, right? Southern border of the United States.
Yeah, Mexico. So Mexico, Arizona. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that gets into the libertarianism is a kind of a disease of privilege, I would say. Where you're like literally sitting on land that was stolen from Mexico by the federal government, and then you're like, oh, the government's not doing anything for me. We need to like cut back all this stuff. It's like the government should do things that benefit me and not other people. It's sort of what it boils down to practically, even if that's not how people sort of see it in their heads.
100%. And she was, for example, very against the border and thought people should have free travel, to pursue work for corporations who would be the sort of leviathans. And so it was also this, anyway, all the incoherent aspects of libertarianism, which is, okay, so there's free movement, but private property, like, right, exactly. Like, her land, she really, her land was hers. But as you say, her land was on stolen land. And there, of course, had to be a state to protect her property interests, but not one to provide, something like, schooling.
Yeah. That's what it is. To have property means that the state protects those property rights. It's not it's a relationship between people, not objects. It's not my land. It's because I have deeds and I can call the police or sue if somebody trespasses. That's what property is.
100%. Yeah.
But it's also fiction. It's a fictional bullshit boundary that, as you pointed out so many times in your writing, Astra, like, we are actually bound up together. We're not actually separated in those ways. And if you fucking put toxic chemicals in the soil, I don't care if that's your soil, that's going to permeate through the ground and reach other people. If you're going to pollute the air above your head, that's going to fuck up other people too, because we're actually connected in ways that these fictions, obscure.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the end of the preview, folks. As usual, we like to mention that this podcast is sponsored by the American Prospect magazine. So if you want to listen to the whole thing, you can subscribe at $5 a month if you want that, plus a free subscription to the website, plus the opportunity for a steeply discounted print subscription. You can do that if you so wish at $10 a month. And otherwise, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.